Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli here, giving you your first online lecture for heart anatomy and histology. The reading for this material can be found in Chapter 18, Sections 1, 2, and 4. You also have a study question or course competency number 6, which addresses what you need to know about this material. In this lecture, we will talk about gross anatomy of the heart as well as microscopic anatomy of the heart. We will go back and forth a little bit between the two. First, beginning with gross anatomy, let's talk about the location of the heart. The heart is located within the pericardial cavity, shown here in purple. That is a subdivision of the entire thoracic cavity, which of course also contains the cavity for the lungs, called the pleural cavity. The pericardial cavity is located centrally along the midline of the thorax in a region called the mediastinum. Here's the mediastinum. The mediastinum extends from the sternum to the vertebral column, but it's just in the midline. It does not include the lateral pleural cavities or the lungs. It contains the thymus gland, the pericardial membrane, cavity, and heart, the great vessels. We call these the great vessels because they're so large, one of which is the aorta, shown here. It also includes the trachea, which is kind of light blue, and it runs down, well, not that far, here, and then it branches into the lungs. Here's the esophagus, a muscular tube that we use for ingesting nutrients, of course. All of those structures are tightly packed, and there's dense connective tissue keeping them all, in the proper location. The heart, although in this midline mediastinum region, is actually slightly to the left of midline. Its base is pretty centrally located. That's the superior portion right here. But the apex obviously points towards the left inferiorly. So this is known as the apex of the heart. Surrounding the heart is a membrane that I've mentioned previously called the pericardial membrane. It functions to isolate and protect the heart from infection. But one of its most important functions is to secrete pericardial fluid, and that provides lubrication so that when the heart expands, contracts, expands, contracts, and then relaxes, gets smaller, it can move freely, so it's lubrication. That pericardial membrane secreting the pericardial fluid is actually made up of two tissue layers, the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium. They are shown here. So this is the pericardial membrane, same thing. And blown up here shows the two separate layers. The outermost layer is the parietal pericardium. The inner layer that adheres very tightly to the heart, called the visceral pericardium. The space in between the two is called the pericardial cavity, and that's where the fluid is secreted by both layers. There are ligaments that attach the pericardial membrane to the diaphragm inferiorly and to the sternum anteriorly, but that's not shown here. The wall of the heart is composed of three separate layers. From superficial to deep, these three layers are the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. The epicardium is actually the exact same structure that we previously looked at, called the visceral pericardium. We know the visceral pericardium is considered part of the pericardial membrane, but because that layer adheres so tightly to the wall of the heart, it's also considered to be part of the heart wall. So in this case, it's called the epicardium. It's made up of primarily epithelial tissue that secretes pericardial fluid. The middle layer is the thickest layer. It's made up of cardiac muscle tissue. So this is the myocardium made up of cardiac muscle tissue. Of course, it will contract and relax, contract and relax. And then the innermost lining of the heart, the chambers are lined with, is the endocardium. That's made up of simple squamous epithelial tissue. So blood is in contact, blood that's in the chambers of the heart is in contact with the endocardium, simple squamous epithelium. Now there are regions of the endocardium that are modified to form valves right here. So the endocardium, it does continue up into the atrium, but it gives off this connective tissue layer, and that's called a valve, an atrioventricular valve that we'll look at soon. And the valves are attached to the myocardium by these strings called chordae tendineae. We will go over that again. So for now we have three layers: epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. Let's look at the myocardium in more detail. The myocardium is the contractile part of the heart wall. So it contains muscle cells. We call those myocardiocytes, sometimes just cardiocytes. But there are two types of myocardiocytes. One type of cell can contract, and so it's called the contractile cardiocyte. Those are the most numerous. And the other type is a conductive cardiocyte. These are specialized cells that can transmit or conduct electrical impulses. Those electrical impulses are needed for the contractile cells to even contract. There aren't any stem cells or satellite cells. You might remember from skeletal muscle tissue that there were satellite cells present that could help regenerate damaged tissue. That is not possible in the heart. There are no stem cells or satellite cells that can divide to replace any lost or damaged cells. One other feature of the myocardium is that all of these cardiocytes need a lot of ATP to allow contraction for your entire life continuously. And this ATP production occurs exclusively by aerobic respiration. So oxygen is required. However, one advantage to aerobic respiration in the heart is that several different types of starting organic materials can be used. Those include fatty acids, glucose, ketones, and amino acids, so proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. Whereas the brain, you might recall, can only use carbohydrate as a starting material for ATP production. The cardiac muscle tissue of the myocardium is probably recognizable to you. You can see the picture up here. The cells themselves are branched and short. They contain very prominent nuclei, and you can also see these lines that are indicative of cardiac muscle tissue called intercalated discs. Some special features of cardiac muscle tissue are for performing aerobic respiration. One is very visible here. It's the storage of glycogen, carbohydrate that can be used to make ATP, or broken down to be used to make ATP, and it seems to be stored primarily around the nuclei of all these cardiocytes. These cells also have many and large mitochondria, And if you recall, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain takes place in the mitochondria, so it's helpful for aerobic respiration to have a lot of mitochondria. The other obvious thing that's needed for aerobic respiration is oxygen, and cardiac muscle tissue has a way to locally store oxygen. It does so on a protein called myoglobin. Myoglobin is much like hemoglobin present in the blood in that it binds up oxygen. So there's a local store of organic starting material. There's many mitochondria for all the enzymes that are going to be needed for aerobic respiration, and there's an oxygen source. The intercalated discs that you might use to identify cardiac muscle tissue are shown in higher magnification in the picture below. These intercalated discs consist of two types of structures. One is desmosomes and the other gap junctions. The desmosomes are cell-to-cell junctions, shown here, that anchor two muscle cells together. Here's one muscle cell and here's another. This helps keep the muscle cells tightly linked during contraction and relaxation, so they're, resistant to separation or slippage. The gap junctions also connect two cells, here in this square, but they are ion channels that allow mainly sodium, but other ions are present too, to flow between cells. The flow of sodium from one cell to another causes excitation as it moves. So these gap junctions help spread excitation from one cell to another. That enables multiple cells to be excited nearly simultaneously, and therefore large regions of the heart can contract nearly simultaneously. Okay, back to gross anatomy. Let's look at larger structures of the heart, in particularly the interior chambers of the heart. There are 4 chambers. The 2 that are superior are the atria, and the 2 that are inferior are ventricles. Both sets are separated by a wall of muscular tissue called a septum. Between the 2, the right atrium and the left atrium, the septum is called the interatrial septum. The septum between the right ventricle and the left ventricle is called the interventricular septum. The atria are smaller, superiorly. They're thinner walled, so when they contract, they don't actually generate as much force as the ventricles do. So if you can feel your heart beating, you're probably feeling more ventricular activity than atrial activity. But the atria do have some unique features. One is the presence of pectinate muscles, and the other is the presence of the fossa ovalis in the adult heart. First, I'll talk about the pectinate muscles. Pectin refers to an arrangement of structures that resemble teeth of a comb, so parallel lines. And an anatomist thought that these ridges looked pretty much parallel, so they called this pectinate muscle. This fossa ovalis is connective tissue that forms shortly after birth over a hole called the foramen ovale. So the foramen ovale was a passageway in the fetal heart that allowed blood to flow from the right atrium to the left atrium. When we talk about fetal circulation, the importance of that will make more sense. In the adult heart, we do not need that anymore, so it's closed off with a connective tissue, and now the remnant is called the fossa ovalis. The ventricles are larger, thicker walled, obviously generating more force when they contract. And they too have some structural features that are unique. One is the presence of ridges of muscle called trabeculae carneae, and the other are these kind of pointed muscles called papillary muscles. The trabeculae carneae are named because it's more of a network of ridges that are haphazard compared to the pectinate muscles in the atrium. And they're also thicker, these ridges. Trabeculae means network, carneae means fleshy or meaty. The papillary muscles hold the valves in place because chordae tendineae connect the valves to the papillary muscle so that the valve isn't just flapping freely within the chamber. These four chambers can be seen externally on the heart as well. The atria are more noticeable than the separation between the two ventricles, but this is the right atrium, this is the left atrium, but what you're actually seeing is a flap of a double layer of tissue. This flap is called an auricle. So this is the left auricle, this is the right auricle, this is the left auricle. And when blood enters the atrium, these flaps can expand to allow more blood volume inside the, kind of like a balloon, inside the atria. The two ventricles, right and left, are distinguished by this line right here, which is called the anterior interventricular sulcus. Now, a sulcus is a groove. So we're not really seeing the groove, but we're seeing what sits in the groove. And that is adipose tissue, which is yellow, and two vessels. The red one is the anterior interventricular artery, and the blue one is the anterior interventricular vein. So this denotes the location of the interventricular septum. So you would call all this right ventricle and all of this the left ventricle. Now let's talk, before we talk about a little bit more gross anatomy with the heart, let's review just some basic things about the circulatory system. So this heart is going to pump blood throughout the body. And as the blood is ejected, it enters vessels. These vessels that carry blood away from the heart are called arteries. So any vessel that has blood flowing away from the heart is called an artery. Now the blood flows out to the systemic tissues, and it travels in smaller and smaller arteries, eventually forming the smallest vessels called capillaries. So this is one capillary bed somewhere inferior in the body, and this is another capillary bed somewhere, oh, this is probably in the lungs, but it could be somewhere anterior in the body as well. The vessels that return blood to the heart are called veins. So the blood leaves the heart in arteries, enters the capillaries, drops off oxygen, takes up waste products like carbon dioxide, and then this deoxygenated blood travels in veins and returns to the heart. So we call arteries kind of the distribution vessels, the capillaries exchange vessels, and the veins kind of return vessels. So if we look at the external anatomy of the heart, we notice there are some very large vessels that are almost always attached to any heart model or specimen for dissection. So we're going to identify a few of these. The two arteries that you can see are the aorta and the pulmonary artery. The aorta is going to be carrying blood from this left ventricle out to the systemic circulation, out to the body. So it clearly is an artery, and it's usually red because it's carrying oxygenated blood, and hemoglobin with oxygen looks red. This one, the pulmonary artery, is called an artery because it's carrying blood from the right ventricle to the lungs. So it's going to split off, it's going to split off into a right branch and a left branch, but this is the pulmonary artery, and it's carrying blood away from the heart. So the blood goes to the lungs and it gets oxygenated. Now it has to return to the heart, and it returns in vessels that are veins, but it's been oxygenated. So these 4 pulmonary veins that the arrows are pointing to are usually colored red to denote the fact that although the blood is returning to the heart, it's oxygenated blood, not deoxygenated blood. So the aorta is carrying oxygenated blood to the systemic part of the body. The pulmonary veins are carrying oxygenated blood from the lungs back to the heart. The pulmonary artery is sending out deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Well, where did that come from? That came from blood that returns back to the heart from the systemic circulation through the superior vena cava here and the inferior vena cava here. They are colored blue because oxygen has been dropped off to the tissues. So, in review, we have 2 arteries, aorta and pulmonary artery, and we really have 6 veins, the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, that both go into the right atrium, and then 4 little pulmonary veins that are going to go into the left atrium. Okay, let's just review a little bit about what you learned here. Spend a few minutes and answer these review questions, and we'll go over the answers in a second. I'll read them to you. Number 1, all of the following are located within the mediastinum except A, the lungs, B, the esophagus, C, the trachea, D, the pericardium, E, the heart. Remember, we're looking for except, what isn't in the mediastinum. Number 2, the most superficial layer of the heart wall is the A, myocardium, B, epicardium, C, endocardium, D, visceral pericardium, E, both B and D, epicardium and visceral pericardium, or F, both C and D, the endocardium and the visceral pericardium. Number 3, the ventricle walls contain ridges of muscle fibers known as A, trabeculae carneae, pectinate muscles is B, C, papillary muscles, D, desmosomes. Okay, 3 more questions. Number 4, vessels that return blood to the atria of the heart include A, the aorta and the inferior vena cava, B, the superior vena cava and the pulmonary artery, C, the inferior vena cava and the pulmonary vein, or D, the pulmonary artery and the aorta. Number 5, intercalated discs connect cardiocytes for what purpose? Please choose all that apply. So there might be more than one right answer. A, to distribute ATP between the cells. B, to prevent tearing during muscle contraction. C, to increase blood flow throughout the myocardium. D, to distribute ions between cells during excitation. And then number 6. Please take a minute to see if you can write names of the vessels that are labeled A, B, and C. Okay, I'll go through the answers with you. Number 1, the answer was lungs. They are not located within the mediastinum. Number 2, the most superficial layer of the heart is called both the epicardium and the visceral pericardium, so the correct answer is E. Number 3, the answer is A, trabeculae carneae. Number 4, the 2 vessels that return blood back to the heart are the inferior vena cava and the pulmonary vein. The aorta is an artery. Obviously, the pulmonary artery is an artery, and those will both send blood away from the heart, so it won't be returning. Okay, 5. There's 2 correct answers for the intercalated discs. They, B, prevent tearing during muscle contraction, and D, they help distribute ions between cells, sodium in particular. I think 6 is difficult until you've spent some time with models. You're just looking at a one-dimensional picture here, but it gives you a little bit of practice. C is the easiest. That's the superior vena cava. Now, A and B are a little bit tough because of where they're taking blood from. But the aorta is always most prominent. It's the thickest, and it always has this distinctive arch. And even though it takes blood from the left side of the heart, it always is more right. And that's because it kind of curves. We can't see it, but interiorly it curves. So B is the aorta. And A is the pulmonary artery taking blood from this right ventricle. So that's all for the first lecture. Thank you.